Hello, my name is Andy Gillies, and this is a speech for simultaneous interpreting with text for the ISIT Diploma exam 2026, and the topic is the Ukraine war and military doctrine. And I'll begin the speech now. Every now and again, technology changes in such a fundamental way that it revolutionizes the way that warfare is actually carried out. Let me give you a couple of simple examples. In the 16th century, the musket was introduced, and it completely changed the way that armies operated, their tactics, their strategies, how many people were necessary. Similar thing happened in World War I with machine guns and artillery. Again, that changed the way that warfare was carried out. Something similar happened in the early 90s with, for example, the first Gulf War, where there was a shift towards relying on very, very sophisticated but precision munitions to strike out targets. And I'm going to suggest in today's speech that the war in Ukraine is another example of where technology is going to completely change the way that belligerents prosecute their wars, operate their wars. In military affairs, these things are called revolutions in military affairs, RMAs, and it basically describes a situation where technology changes the way that operations are carried out during warfare and changes the doctrines underlying them. So let me give you a couple of examples. It's certainly not an exhaustive list of some of the doctrines that are being challenged by the fighting in Ukraine. The first one is air superiority. For as long as I've been alive, air superiority has been one of the key things that any warring party has sought to achieve. Because, as the doctrine has it, if you control the air, you can then control the land and what your troops do on land. But the assumption underlying that is that airspace is a unitary space, a single space. And this has worked very well up until now. However, in Ukraine, what we can see is that there are several levels of airspace. Ukraine does not control all of its airspace at high altitude. However, its surveillance drones operating at extremely low altitude, where planes cannot, offer such good surveillance that the Russians are not able to, for example, mass troops for attack without being seen by Ukrainian surveillance drones. So the concept of airspace, and therefore the way that fits into combat operations, is completely changing. The second doctrine that is in the course of changing, or will have to change, is one that's been with us since the early 90s, and that is the doctrine of accuracy over volume. What does that mean? Well, in the early 90s, particularly the first Gulf War, military operations were focused on high precision munitions like cruise missiles that could take out enemy targets and infrastructure. Each individual missile was extremely expensive, but you didn't need very many of them, and you didn't need very many troops on the ground. So that's accuracy versus volume. However, in Ukraine, what we're seeing is that accuracy is now no longer an expensive commodity. Cheap drones can be very accurate over very long distances. And now, because drones are cheap, you no longer have to have this trade-off of accuracy and volume. If Russia sends an expensive drone to Ukraine to destroy something, The Ukrainians can shoot that down with a very cheap drone, or alternatively they can send a very cheap drone a long way into Russia to attack Russian infrastructure. So the war starts to become not a question of accuracy, but a question of volume and cost. Mass drone attacks are very difficult to repel with expensive munitions because the expensive munitions run out. So there's a big change going on there in the way that military attacks are organised. And then the last doctrine that I would suggest is changing, and which is linked to the one that I've just talked about, is that it's not really about having superior technology. In the past, it's always been the country with superior technology that has supposedly had a big advantage in warfare. But what we're seeing in Ukraine is that it's not so much about the technology, but about the integration of the technology and the networking, the connectivity of the technology. Ukraine is using off-the-shelf, sometimes even consumer technology to inform its battlefield decisions. But it interlinks them so well that it's becoming a real advantage. The system that they use to do that is called Delta, and it basically layers information coming from different sources. What does that mean? Well, for example, you might have a radio antenna telling you that a particular area has a lot of radio traffic. And then you might have satellite pictures showing you different buildings. And then you might have some CCTV cameras showing you traffic on the road. Well, if those are separate, you don't have enough information to pick a target. But if you put the three data sources together and layer them one on top of the other, you might be able to identify that the same building has a lot of radio traffic and a lot of people coming in and out, and that therefore it's a command center and you might want to target it. So doctrine is changing. What then are the lessons for NATO? Well, let me read for you briefly from the report that I handed out earlier by the IFRI. And I will start on page 6. Halfway down the page, the second paragraph beginning a recurring debate. And I'll start reading now. A recurring debate in Western military policy circles questions the relevance of Ukraine's experience for NATO. Critics point to differences in force structure, often noting that Ukraine lacks the depth of air and naval power available to the alliance, and that the nuclear dimension plays a fundamentally different role for a non-nuclear state than for a nuclear alliance. These arguments may be valid, but they largely miss the strategic point. The Russian conventional military threat to NATO that will emerge from this war is being reshaped at scale by Ukrainian battlefield experience acquired against a determined and adaptive opponent. If Russia seeks to confront, openly or covertly, the alliance in the years ahead, it will do so using tactics and technologies refined in Ukraine. Indeed, it already does, as demonstrate drone flights over the NATO territories. Learning from the Ukrainian battlefield is therefore not about preparing to fight like Ukraine. It's about understanding how Russia now fights, adapts, and innovates after having confronted the full spectrum of modern warfare. In that sense, Ukraine represents a unique and time-sensitive opportunity for NATO to learn from the only country that has absorbed and resisted the weight of Russian military power in the field. One of the central findings of this report is that few technologies observed in Ukraine are truly new in isolation. Drones, satellite communications, electronic warfare, precision strikes, and data fusion all predate the war. What is new and consequential is the way these technologies have been combined, scaled, integrated, and employed throughout a fundamentally, integrated and employed through a fundamentally digital native mindset. Ukraine's armed forces have relied extensively on civilian-grade, state-of-the-art technologies, repurposed and adapted at speed for military use. Commercial drones, cloud-based software, private satellite constellations, open-source intelligence, and AI-enabled processing tools have been woven into a dense, adaptive, operational fabric. The result is not a collection of novel gadgets, but the emergence of a lethal kill web in which sensors, shooters, communications, and decision support tools are tightly coupled, continuously updated, and increasingly automated. And I'll stop reading there. So I think we can see that there are really some big lessons for NATO to learn. It's very important that we don't write off the way Ukraine is fighting this war as some sort of poor man's solution to the problem of not having a good enough air force or enough artillery. This is a modern, sophisticated and networked response to the threat that Ukraine is facing. So we need to learn the lessons from that, and just like Ukraine is doing, we need to learn to adapt very quickly for any potential future threat from Russia or indeed any other country. Thank you.